In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, there was an entire wave of movies about superheroes and bizarre vigilantes. These projects came in all shapes and forms: The Rocketeer, The Phantom, Spawn, The Crow, Dick Tracy, Darkman, and that's without even mentioning the more obvious examples like Batman. At first glance, The Shadow looks like just another entry in that same lineup, built from the same ingredients: a superhero, a villain, the hero's love interest, a large-scale conflict. But there's a catch. The Shadow isn't just another guy in a cape, because he existed long before modern superheroes ever did, and without him, half of them might not have existed at all. My name is Max Chkonia, and today, in our Cinema Underground series, we're breaking down The Shadow.
Because only the shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men.
The Shadow was released in 1994 and opens with a rather unusual backstory. The main character, Lamont Cranston, wasn't always a hero. He used to be a criminal. He lived in Asia, dealt in illegal substances, and was essentially a military leader within the local underworld. At some point, he encounters a group of Tibetan monks who help him change his life and teach him how to control the mind, both his own and other people's. After that, Cranston returns to New York and begins operating as The Shadow, a mysterious vigilante who fights crime while remaining invisible to his enemies. His main ability is creating illusions, making people unable to see him or perceive reality in a distorted way. At the same time, the film's main antagonist arrives in the city, Shivan Khan, who claims to be a descendant of Genghis Khan, and he probably is, since we have no reason not to believe him. Shivan Khan possesses abilities similar to the Shadow's, but he uses them to seize power. His goal is to gain control over nuclear weapons and effectively subjugate the world. From there, the story revolves around the confrontation between these two characters. Cranston tries to stop Khan, while also working with a small group of allies who never fully understand who he really is. The story also introduces a romantic subplot involving Margot Lane, a woman who possesses telepathic abilities herself and gradually begins to suspect the hero's double life. The central conflict isn't just about preventing catastrophe, but about the clash between two characters with similar powers and completely different approaches to using them. Khan acts openly and aggressively, he seeks power. The Shadow, on the other hand, hides in the background, manipulates events, and tries to control everything from the shadows. Sorry for the pun. In the finale, the film builds toward a direct confrontation between them, where not only the fate of the city is decided, but also the question of who truly has greater mastery over these abilities and whose strategy will prove more effective. But what we see in the film is only a small fragment of the rich history behind a character who first appeared 65 years earlier, and that's one of the reasons why, if you watch The Shadow today without any context, a lot of it can feel confusing. So let's briefly go through the history of a character who has more experience fighting evil than many modern superheroes combined. The real story of The Shadow began in 1930 with a marketing gimmick. A major New York publisher, Street and Smith, which specialized in pulp magazines, decided to use radio to promote its paper flagship, the Detective Story Hour series. And here we need to step into the broader context of the pulp era itself, because it helps explain the kind of culture The Shadow emerged from. The term pulp comes from the phrase wood pulp, the cheap paper these magazines were printed on during the first half of the 20th century. They were inexpensive publications sold for pennies and aimed at the widest audience possible. This was an enormous part of the entertainment industry of its time. These magazines featured all kinds of stories: detective fiction, adventure tales, supernatural horror, science fiction, and all of it was constantly mixed together. The same hero could investigate crimes, fight a mad scientist, and run into something supernatural, all within a single story. What's important is that these stories never really aimed for realism or deep psychological complexity. Their purpose was simple: grab the audience's attention as quickly as possible and entertain them. That's where the defining traits of pulp culture came from. Colorful, sometimes almost cartoonish characters, simple but highly effective plots, atmosphere taking priority over logic, and a constant feeling of danger and adventure. It was a kind of pure mass culture, completely unconcerned with prestige or seriousness, yet enormously influential on everything that came afterward.
Pulp magazines are generally considered either a form of dime store literature or one of its foundational influences. The broader history of pulp fiction is actually much richer than that, but that's a conversation of another time.
On July 31st, 1930, the radio program Detective Story Hour premiered. It was meant to serve as an advertisement for exactly these kinds of unpretentious pulp stories. To tie all the stories together, the creators needed a mysterious narrator. Several names were suggested: the inspector, the detective, and finally, the Shadow. At this stage, the Shadow wasn't actually the hero of the novels yet. He was simply the radio narrator, introducing all these stories and encouraging listeners to buy the printed magazine versions. One of the actors reading the stories on air was Frank Reddick Jr., who quickly became beloved by listeners because of his voice. It was a creepy, raspy whisper accompanied by a truly chilling laughter.
Does not pay. The Shadow knows.
And this is where the publisher's plan completely backfired. Nobody cared about the detective story magazine they were trying to advertise. Listeners only wanted the Shadow. People constantly walked up to newspaper kiosks asking for that Shadow magazine, a magazine that didn't actually exist. Realizing they had struck gold, the publisher rushed to create a full-fledged character around the already popular radio brand. For this, they hired a young writer named Walter B. Gibson, and that turned out to be a perfect choice. Gibson wasn't just a journalist, he was also a professional magician. That background as an illusionist ended up shaping the Shadow's abilities. Gibson used his knowledge of stage magic and deception to teach the character how to disappear and manipulate the minds of his enemies. Over the course of his career, Gibson wrote 282 out of the 325 Shadow novels. He produced one novel every month, sometimes writing as many as 10,000 words a day. On April 1st, 1931, the first issue of the Shadow magazine went on sale, featuring the story The Living Shadow. That's how Lamont Cranston and the mysterious The Shadow were born. And then, in 1937, the story came full circle. In September of that year, a brand new standalone radio drama called The Shadow premiered. The role of Lamont Cranston and his alter ego went to a very young Orson Welles, the future creator of Citizen Kane and the famous radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds, which sounded so realistic that it genuinely terrified listeners. The radio show opened with orchestral music, over which Orson Welles, in his deep baritone voice, delivered one of the most iconic lines in the history of American pop culture.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
This was the Shadow's golden age, the absolute peak of his popularity. But nothing lasts forever. The 50s arrived. Television came crashing in, and brightly colored superheroes in tights like Superman finally finished off the market for dark pulp fiction. The Shadow tried to escape the fading darkness of old radio by moving into low-budget serials and movies hovering somewhere near B-movie territory. I won't go too deep into those adaptations here, none of them achieved any major success or lasting cultural significance, and the Shadow's abilities and personality changed wildly from one project to another. Sometimes the Shadow couldn't even turn invisible and basically just stood around in dark corners. Other times, he became a bizarre bargain bin version of James Bond, throwing out cheesy one-liners and punching bad guys in flimsy cardboard sets. So, the Shadow is a character who went through countless stages of evolution. He began as a narrator for a promotional radio show, gained flesh and blood through a writer-magician, became a mystical superhero thanks to the voice of Orson Welles, and took a few painful hits during his first attempt to conquer television. All of these elements eventually merged together and became the foundation for the 1994 film adaptation. And the Shadow also influenced a huge number of the superheroes that dominate pop culture today. For many comic book creators, the Shadow became not necessarily the main inspiration, but an incredibly important one. Stan Lee, Bob Kane, and Steve Ditko, the creators behind some of the world's most famous heroes, all grew up on Shadow novels and radio dramas, and that influence clearly found its way into their work. Entire concepts, story structures, and even gadgets were borrowed. The strongest influence, of course, can be seen in Batman. Bob Kane, who created Gotham's vigilante together with Bill Finger, based many of Batman's defining traits on the Shadow. In fact, the very first Batman comic from 1939, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, is essentially a variation of an earlier Shadow story called Partners of Peril. Bill Finger himself later talked about this openly. And honestly, you don't even need to dig into the history to notice the similarities between the two heroes. Lamont Cranston becomes the Shadow, Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. In everyday life, both are wealthy, highly visible members of their city's elite. At night, they become hidden vigilantes. Both Batman and the Shadow don't just fight crime, they intentionally create terrifying personas. Batman presents himself as a creature of the night, sometimes almost demonic. The Shadow is an invisible figure, practically a voice emerging from darkness itself. Neither of them officially belongs to the justice system, although that's a common superhero trope in general. The police distrust them, they operate independently, and they constantly break the rules. And then there's the Batcave. The Shadow had his own secret headquarters too, filled with advanced equipment. In the novels, it was called the Sanctum. You can even catch echoes of this idea in stories about Doctor Strange. Which means we are now drifting into the Marvel Comics universe. Doctor Strange's hidden base is called the Sanctum Sanctorum. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were massive fans of the pulp era, and Doctor Strange himself shares certain similarities with the Shadow. Like the Shadow, he undergoes a kind of spiritual transformation in Asia before returning home to fight for good. And you can find a similar backstory in Moon Knight as well, another hero shaped by journeys abroad, personal downfall, and the triumphant return home to protect the city from criminals. Moon Knight shares several traits with the Shadow. Both present themselves as wealthy millionaires by day in order to become superheroes by night. And Moon Knight, just like the Shadow, eventually gathers an entire support team of ordinary people helping him behind the scenes. In the early 90s, Universal Pictures decided to go all in. Obsessed with the idea of creating their own dark franchise capable of competing with Batman from Warner Bros., the studio executives allocated a substantial $40 million budget to revive the Shadow. This was a passion project approached with almost obsessive attention to detail. $40 million was a huge amount for 1994, though not exactly record-breaking. For comparison, True Lies by James Cameron cost nearly $120 million. Meanwhile, The Mask, a film that's impossible not to compare to The Shadow, was made for almost half the budget, around $23 million. And honestly, the movie with Jim Carrey somehow looks more expensive on screen. The screenplay was assigned to David Koepp, whose career was exploding at the time. He had already written scripts for Jurassic Park and Carlito's Way. And Koepp immediately ran into a serious problem. Which version of The Shadow should he adapt? The literary version, where the hero is essentially a master of disguise carrying two pistols, or the radio version, where he possesses supernatural invisibility. In the end, Koepp decided to merge both versions of the character into one. He borrowed the mystical mind-clouding abilities from the radio dramas while preserving the vast network of agents and the visual aesthetics of the pulp novels. More importantly, he gave the hero a genuinely dark and bloody past. The Shadow stories are famous for one of the most recognizable lines in American pop culture history. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. Koepp asked himself a simple question: how does the Shadow know what evil lurks in the hearts of men? And his answer was, because he knows the evil inside his own heart extremely well. That psychological twist became the foundation of the entire film. The movie transformed from a straightforward pulp adventure into a story about guilt and redemption. In the film, Lamont Cranston is not just a bored millionaire looking for thrills. In the prologue, we learned that he settled in Tibet, where he became a brutal drug lord and murderer known as In Ko. His heroic journey begins not with the noble intentions, but with forced redemption under the guidance of a Tibetan monk. So the film's version of the Shadow doesn't save people because he is some pure-hearted, idealistic superhero. He saves them because he is terrified of the darkness inside himself. That same idea is reflected in the hero's superpowers. He can conceal his body, but he cannot conceal his shadow, because light cannot be deceived. And for this story, they found the perfect director, Russell Mulcahy, best known for Highlander. In some ways, it's a very similar story about a man standing against evil. Visually, the films are also share certain similarities. Even though The Shadow came out almost a decade later, Mulcahy refused to rely entirely on computer graphics. By 1994, CGI was already becoming a major part of filmmaking, but The Shadow still uses plenty of traditional practical effects. Mulcahy insisted, there are a lot of special effects in the film, but it's not a film about special effects, it's a character-driven story. The effects are part of the story. That famous flying Forbo dagger with the living face hunting the hero, for example, was created partly through animatronics and partly as one of the most technically complicated CGI objects of its time. David Koepp specifically envisioned Alec Baldwin in the lead role and wrote the screenplay with him in mind from the very beginning. Critics noted that Baldwin had the eyes and the voice, exactly the qualities needed for a character whose power is primarily vocal and psychological rather than physical. His ability to balance subtle irony with genuine dramatic weight perfectly matched Lamont's dual nature, a charming playboy on the outside and a dramatized warrior underneath. By 1994, Baldwin was at the absolute peak of his movie star phase. 1990, his breakout role as Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October. 1992, his performance in Glengarry Glen Ross alongside Al Pacino and Jack Lemmon. 1993, the psychotic Dr. Judd Hill in Malice. The Shadow was supposed to be the next step, the launch of a massive franchise in the spirit of Batman by Tim Burton, with Alec Baldwin becoming a full-fledged A-list superstar. As you can probably guess, those plans never came true. Particular attention was paid to Baldwin's facial transformation in the film. CGI still wasn't advanced enough to realistically alter actors' faces, so the director relied on a combination of makeup and optical morphing, a technology famously used a few years earlier in Terminator 2: Judgment Day. And the result genuinely worked. The Shadow's face feels like a completely different person, even though it's still Baldwin underneath the makeup. Interestingly, because of the special contact lenses used during filming, Baldwin could barely see anything and often had to be physically guided around the set by crew members. Baldwin played a man carrying the weight of his past mistakes. This wasn't just another costumed hero, it was a character whose strength came from confronting the evil within himself. His Lamont Cranston is a charming playboy with a sharp sense of irony, but the moment he puts on the cloak, Baldwin completely transforms. After The Shadow, Baldwin never played another superhero and rarely returned to straightforward genre blockbusters at all. At different points in time, both Robert Zemeckis and Sam Raimi tried to create their own versions of The Shadow, and while Zemeckis' attempt remained little more than an interesting piece of trivia, Raimi actually managed to realize the idea to some extent, though once again with a twist. Raimi, best known as the director of The Evil Dead and the original Spider-Man trilogy, refused to let the rejection stop him, so in 1990 he made Darkman instead, a dark superhero movie inspired by that same pulp aesthetic. It tells the story of scientist Peyton Westlake, who after a brutal attack becomes a horribly disfigured vigilante capable of wearing other people's faces. The film turned out far more grotesque and horror-oriented, full of frantic camera work, painful makeup effects, and the protagonist constantly balancing between revenge and complete madness. This is no subtle manipulator like The Shadow, this is a man literally falling apart, both physically and psychologically. Raimi later openly admitted that he originally wanted to make a film about The Shadow, but couldn't secure the rights, so he created his own hero instead. And honestly, Darkman can basically be viewed as an alternative universe version of the same concept, a kind of multiverse before multiverses became fashionable. The difference is that Raimi ended up making something far more radical and tonally cohesive, and importantly, commercially successful. And this is just one example of niche superhero cinema from the 90s, a true lost league. The Shadow, Darkman, Dick Tracy, Spawn, The Rocketeer, The Phantom, The Mask. Regardless of the place each of these movies ultimately took in film history or in the hearts of audiences, every single one of them influenced modern action cinema in some way, and you can find shared DNA running through all of them: retro aesthetics, morally ambiguous heroes, stylized violence. Back then, nobody was talking about cinematic universes yet. Each of these films existed in complete isolation. Modern superhero cinema is an industry where every movie is merely another piece of a larger face, but the niche superhero films of the 90s were the last wave where a superhero movie could still feel like a director's personal project or a genuinely strange experiment. Obviously, I'm generalizing here, but on a broader level, superhero cinema has definitely lost some of that charm. At the same time, I don't want to put all these films on a pedestal. Not all of them are good, and some are honestly pretty bad. The Shadow premiered on July 1st, 1994. That same month also saw the release of The Lion King and The Mask, starring Jim Carrey, and both absolutely crushed The Shadow at the box office. The film earned only $32 million against a $40 million budget, which of course was considered a commercial failure and instantly buried any plans for a franchise. The movie ended up feeling too archaic for fans of modern action films, too costume-heavy for noir audiences, and too literary for mainstream viewers. Roger Ebert, one of the most influential critics of the era, gave the film 2.5 stars out of 4, noting that the movie looks great but doesn't know where it's going. Other reviewers were far less forgiving. Critics accused the film of being campy and unable to decide whether it wanted to be ironic or completely serious. Ironically, the very qualities critics attacked back then, its stylization, its rejection of realism, are now viewed as strengths. But in 1994, Hollywood was still learning how to turn comic books into blockbusters and honestly had no idea which direction the genre should evolve in. And today, the film is rightly considered a cult classic. It's beloved by fans of pulp fiction and enthusiasts of 1930s radio serials. Maybe not the largest community in the world, but definitely a loyal one. The film is also appreciated by admirers of Art Deco aesthetics and practical effects. Its visual world, a New York of skyscrapers, fog and neon lights, became an object of fascination for designers, architects and lovers of vintage style. The handcrafted sets built without green screens, the handmade costumes, the makeup effects instead of digital de-aging, all of that is valued much more today than endless CGI backgrounds. The Shadow also holds special value for fans of Alec Baldwin. It was one of the final roles from his movie star era, a kind of alternate history showing what his career might have become. And finally, the film benefits from modern superhero fatigue, especially the counterculture reaction against Marvel Studios. In an era where superhero cinema has reached a point of oversaturation, The Shadow has become a symbol of a different path. Something that feels, in a strange way, more sincere and more cinematic. Before Superman, before Batman, before Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, there was him, the Shadow, the first true superhero of mass culture, a voice on the radio in 1930, a laugh in the darkness, a question asked to millions of listeners: who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? And I genuinely like the movie. Sure, you can laugh at some of its awkwardness from time to time, but affectionately. It has a morally ambiguous hero, a charismatic villain, and an incredible 30s atmosphere. What else do you really need for a good Friday evening? This was Max Chkonia and the voice actor behind the narration, Max Matyushenko. And very soon we'll meet again in another video. See you everyone!